Is Jamie, by the way. So anyway, so she doesn't want to like toot her own horn, but she really is great. And so she's the reason why GMT gets all the buses, you know, on the road every day, because there's routes and schedules to follow, and she's totally in charge of all that.
That's giving me a lot of credit. I appreciate it.
Yes, indeed, indeed. Jamie, are you going to sit there, or do you want to go to the podium? Welcome, Jamie Smith.
So I'll start by saying I have been with Green Mountain Transit for nearly 15 years. So I have a vast perspective on transportation when it's really, really great. And I have seen in the last few years transportation take a nosedive, and it has slowly been rebounding. So I'm going to get a little, you know, my first couple slides are a little bit of a bummer, but I will bring it back at the end to talk about some exciting things that we're doing at Green Mountain Transit. So COVID-19, obviously we were all affected by this, and then the media happened, and this is what people were seeing about public transportation. It's unsafe, you're going to get sick, don't get on board. And the science and the media were not keeping pace. So by the time it was reported that you're not really going to get sick, your exposure is pretty minimal, especially if you are distancing on board, it was too late. And we saw images of empty trains, buses, airplanes, and I don't know if you remember driving around the state, but there just weren't a lot of people around. There weren't even a lot of people in their own cars. I remember a friend of mine saying, I went to the dentist and on the intake form it said, have you ridden public transportation in the last 14 days? And while that wasn't a disqualifier for that trip, it certainly like put into perspective the correlation between public transportation and COVID-19. So this is a national chart. It's a little hard to see, but this is March of 2020. And you can see that nationwide and locally, public transportation ridership took a complete nosedive. This is data that's been gathered by Transit app. So if you are familiar with Transit app locally, that's what GMT uses for our real-time information. And APTA, which is the American Public Transit Association. So they've gathered this data, and you can sort of follow the trajectory of COVID. We know that we had surges, ridership would start to build again, and then it would, you know, drop right down dramatically. And you can just see the gradual increase as we sort of got to like October last year. So this is two charts that talk a little bit about mobility shift. So we started to see in Chittenden County, the use of public transportation by activity was dropping. So retail and recreation was, you know, immediately dropped down 10%, but below the baseline of what it was pre-COVID. We started to see people, you know, not being able to get to the grocery store or pharmacy, or not taking the bus to get to those places. And then work was definitely one of those 25% below the baseline. So, you know, folks who are commuting, and this holds true today. And, you know, we all know that the workplace has changed. Teleworking has certainly affected COVID, public transportation ridership. And while we are at 85% of our ridership compared to pre-pandemic levels, we are well below that for our transportation regionally. So our Link Express routes that go between Burlington and Montpelier, Burlington and St. Albans are still 70% below pre-pandemic ridership. So it's a huge, you know, regionally, that's a huge impact. We are seeing our local routes come back up. Certainly we have heard from a lot of our riders that they are essential in their job. Public transportation is their only way to get to and from work. So we're starting to see that increase. As we sort of went through the pandemic, there was a lot of media about not having enough staff, not having enough mechanics. That's a continued challenge, but we lost a lot of our workforce pretty dramatically, pretty quickly. At the start of the pandemic, we had drivers who were either vulnerable to COVID or had some pre-existing condition, and they just stopped driving for us. So, we started to see these images on the media, empty buses, masks, things like that. So it's not all bad news, as I said. You can kind of follow the trajectory, again, the drop, but we're starting to come back. This is September of 2022, and our local ridership is coming back very strongly. So we're encouraged by that, and we continue to see that. You can see that sort of between July and September, it was a really dramatic increase, and we're seeing that as well in our rural system. This is just our urban Chittenden County system, but local ridership is coming back in central Vermont and Franklin County as well. So I'm about to use a term that I have come to not enjoy, which is the new normal, and just sort of setting a baseline. Internally, we're trying to look at this as, this is the base level. We need to stop comparing what transportation is today to what transportation was pre-pandemic. The workforce has changed, staffing limitations have changed, and so what are we doing to try to at least get people back on board now and be a little bit more innovative? So technology upgrades, this was a big one for us at the start of the pandemic. The lull in ridership allowed for GMT to do some really innovative upgrades to our transportation. We were having lots of issues with transit app, especially in our downtown cores, in all of our service regions, where our buses when they follow each other in downtown, the system wasn't able to locate them on the map. So people were standing at bus stops, seeing a bus, and then it would completely disappear. And so during the pandemic, we took a step back and we worked with our technology partners, Transit and Swiftly. And we made some improvements. So we have onboard capacity. This is an image, but that's what the tablet looks like on board our vehicle. That is both beneficial to passengers because now we have accurate real-time information, but it's also beneficial to our drivers on board because it gives them a visual cue as to their performance, where they are en route, are they ahead of schedule, are they behind schedule, and what's their pickup location. We put in a module that allowed us to do real-time detour management through Transit app. So a driver will see the next stop on their tablet, and it'll be crossed out if we're on detour or if they have to do something to shift. And that information is also being passed on to our riders. So nobody's standing at a bus stop that GMT isn't going to serve if they're using the app. Bus crowding. We know that people's comfort riding public transportation is slowly starting to come back, but we were trying to explore options about what could we do to assist people in feeling comfortable getting back on board. And so we partnered with Transit app. This is a completely crowdsourced system that we use. People who are using the app on board can say, my bus is really crowded, it's not crowded, and it feeds that information to passengers downstream that tells them. So if somebody is really uncomfortable getting on a super crowded bus still, they have that information on their phone to be able to tell them, maybe you want to take the next bus or not take this one, but we don't want people to continue to feel uncomfortable riding. So we've tried to put this solution in place. So this is some sort of jargony from our technology partners image, but essentially what it means is we've opened up our technology ecosystem to allow for us to partner with lots of different technology vendors. So before we had a lot of limitations on board our vehicle where we had to have a very specific camera system that needed to speak to our radio, that needed to speak to all of these things. So now we've opened up our ecosystem and we can partner with Swiftly. We are partnering with an APC vendor, which is an automated passenger counting vendor, which will use camera technology to record ridership on board our vehicles. We are working with another technology vendor on next stop enunciation. So folks who have low hearing or no hearing, low sight or no sight, can hear the next stop enunciator, and then it'll feed information for folks who can't hear that announcement through the PA system. Hopefully we'll continue to work with technology vendors to improve even more. If we bring fares back into the system, automatic fare collection, so we don't have to do cash and paper passes and things like that anymore. So that's future stuff. But one of the most innovative things that GMT is sort of working on right now, you might have heard this term recently or even today, is microtransit. So we launched in partnership with VTrans the first microtransit system in the state of Vermont. This is in our Montpelier service area. And essentially it's Uber for public transportation. So folks are able to say, within a 12-mile radius, I want to get from this point to this point at this time. It takes the need to stand outside and wait for a fixed route, to plan around fixed route service, and it kind of gives passengers the autonomy to create their own schedule. This is the first project. It's been very successful. VTrans and VPTA recently issued an RFP for an additional 12 feasibility studies across the state. And Dan can probably answer how many of those are being funded or implemented. 5 of the 12 are being implemented in the very near future, but this continues to be something the state of Vermont is looking at. GMT has done a feasibility study to look at our Barrie service area, and just this morning our board approved a decision to look at St. Albans as our next feasibility area. So microtransit is something that we're excited about and the state is excited about, and I think it will just keep making public transportation more convenient for folks.
I have a question on that. Is funding, do you know the cost of that? Is it free for riders or?
It's free for riders. So the state of Vermont is fare free, and the service is the same.
Great, thank you.
Yeah. And then really exciting, GMT, Marble Valley Regional Transit, and VTrans partnered on a low-no application, which is low or no emission vehicle program. It's a federal grant, and the state of Vermont was awarded a lot of money for vehicle electrification and infrastructure upgrade. And so this is the new Flyer XE40. GMT is going to be ordering 5 new battery electric vehicles for our system. We currently have 2. Marble Valley will have another 4 plus a Latenda.
No, 4 Latendas.
4 Latendas, okay.
Marble Valley.
They won't have this model. They'll have a different model. Latenda is a battery electric bus company outside of Montreal. So in the very near future, these will come into the system. But what's most exciting is that we'll be working with New Flyer Industries on infrastructure upgrades. So that will allow us to continue to electrify our fleet in the future, bringing more battery electric vehicles into our system. And so I put this on here because I really wanted folks to be able to tell us what they think, what you all think the future of public transportation is. I don't have a crystal ball. We just are following ridership trends and national trends, but I put this up here and it's a conversation format in SurveyMonkey, so folks are able to go in, have conversations about that, and GMT will look at that feedback and look at that as we're making our future long-range transit plans. And I sort of breezed through this, but I'm happy to open that up and we can talk about it now and you don't have to do it in SurveyMonkey.
Back to the QR code.
Sure. Anybody have any?
So you were talking about looking at feasibility in St. Albans, you're looking at St. Albans, and then did you say that you're looking at that there's 5 that are currently?
So across the state of Vermont, there were 12 feasibility studies that were conducted in this last fiscal year, and 5 of those feasibility studies are moving forward to implementation. So they're not GMT projects, they're at other transit agencies across the state.
Okay, cool. Can you share what those 5 ones are? Do you remember?
course I do. So Barry, as was mentioned, there's gonna be one in Middlebury. That one is still in the planning phase. There's gonna be one in Manchester. Springfield is going to have one, and then there was, I can't remember if it was Bellows Falls. Anyway, the down in southern Vermont is gonna have
Cool.
2 overruns.
And could you talk a little bit about what are some of the things that make an area more feasible,
Sure.
a candidate for?
Yeah, I just talked about this morning. So we looked at a number of criteria when considering a service area. The first is connectivity. So we didn't want to create a microtransit system that's sort of in a bubble. We wanted folks who are using that system to be able to travel regionally. So making sure that system connects to other transportation systems. This feasibility process, because of the funding source, meant that it needed to be in one of our rural service areas, which is really important. Folks in our rural service area don't have great access, as we've heard a lot today, to public transportation options. The third criteria was that it was a service area that GMT hadn't done a recent exploration of this type of project. So St. Albans is not an area that we have looked at very recently into making improvements. And the last was efficiency of service. So we provide lots of different types of service at GMT, including E&D, which is Elders and Disabled Program services, Medicaid program, non-emergency medical transportation. And so making sure that this system was set up so folks who, regardless of the program that they are requesting funding through, can use this microtransit service. Sure.
I've got a question. You mentioned that ridership on a lot of the routes is close to, at least close to where it was pre-pandemic. And I'm wondering if you have any feeling of, any way of knowing how much of that is because it's fare-free and sort of, what that means for the future. And what that means for the possibility, and also that, and also what does the fare-free, like what are the implications of that for increasing service or improving service?
Sure. So we are long overdue for a customer survey. And so we don't have data currently that talks about folks' reasons for travel. So I don't know what percentage of folks are on board because it's fare free. It's no secret that public transportation is not funded at a level that's sustainable and allows for us to expand. But one of the biggest challenges that everybody is facing is non-federal local match dollars. And so we use some of the fare revenue, especially fare revenue that's generated from the universities, as non-federal local match, which allows us to draw federal funding down. And so not having a fare has created a little bit of a challenge with having those local match dollars. But it has lots of benefits as well. It definitely speeds up boarding, takes a lot of passenger driver conflict out of the mix. There's not this sense of having to police the fare box or, things that might have caused challenges in the past. The fare box is a touch point on the bus, so it eliminates, anybody who's concerned about getting on for COVID-related reasons. It eliminates some of those touch points on board the vehicle. And our on-time performance has increased probably 40% since going fare-free. And that's certainly because, we're not holding up the vehicle, 10 people boarding and having to pay a fare. So that's where, the digital fare collection would come in the future if we did go back to collecting a fare. We did receive some one-time funding through the legislature last year that allowed us to not only make some service cuts that we were proposing, but also allowed us to remain fare-free in this current fiscal year. And so there hasn't been a lot of conversation yet at a board level about the legislative process for the next fiscal year, or if we'll be requesting that funding. But I will say that the new buses we have coming into our fleet don't have a fare box. And And so hopefully, that's a good sign for potential fare-free service, but I don't really have much of an update there. We had one other question, Ryan, and then I'll go back to you.
Hey Jamie, John from Old Folks Home, and I live in Montpelier, work in Burlington. I'm a passionate fan of the bus between the two places. I wouldn't have taken the job if not for excellent service. I find the time to be tremendously productive for me at the beginning and end of each day with my laptop and on my lap. So mostly just want to say thank you, and thank you for retaining essentially 4 trips each way at the beginning and end of the day that really allow a parent, and it allows for me to integrate that bus into a very busy life without really making any compromises. In fact, I'm sort of, when I drive, I lose 90 minutes of productivity versus taking the bus. So that's my advertisement to you, like, if there's anywhere near a bus line.
Yeah, John, when we do a testimonial campaign, I'm gonna call you.
So just big appreciation. We hosted, with the support of Energy Action Network, we hosted a focus group this summer of a mix of people in the Old North End. They were extremely enthusiastic about free fares, I have to say. Now that's one little snapshot, 20 people at our shop, but I personally would be perfectly happy to pay fares. And in fact, if I have a worry, it's like I don't really like decoupling your sort of total financial circumstance from ridership. Like I want, if there's more riders, for you to have more income, maybe to be able to add service. And that feels a little unfortunate to totally decouple. On the other hand, I know there's a set of folks for whom it's really making a big difference in terms of just, there's no decision. When visitors come to the state, like buses can be intimidating because you're like, do I need a card? What's the fare? All of that. And so I guess I'm coming at both sides of that. I think the conundrum, I'll be interested to see how you all work it out.
Yeah, no, thank you. And it's unfortunate that some of these decisions have to be tied to the financial, but that's sort of the reality, I guess, of this type of service. But when looking at equity and when we have to propose service cuts, it's certainly a tough decision every single time. And we did a big engagement with our link riders when we made those service cuts, and we received probably the most amount of surveys I've ever received in a survey, which was great. We needed to have that data, and specifically we heard lots of folks who had issues with childcare and needing to get a lead enough bus so they could deal with dropping kids off and all that, and then getting back at the end of the day. So I'm glad that schedule is working out for riders, and knock on wood, I haven't heard a lot of negativity from that new link schedule. So hopefully ridership increases and the demand increases and we can get some of those trips that we had to take out of the system back.
How many trips did you get out of the system for the links, Jamie?
We ended up taking 3. So we took away 2 AM trips and 1 PM, and we used to operate an express trip to Waterbury and back, and we mostly took those away and just combined those with other full link trips to Montpelier. So now, by request, those buses will go into Waterbury.
There is one little room for improvement, which is sometimes 2 buses end up in Waterbury at the same time heading north, and one bus could easily skip Waterbury and save us some time. So that's like a little, yes.
We should talk about that time because it might be one of our requests, and if the request time is unneeded, we could certainly make that adjustment.
Right.
Tom?
With the looming legislative ask to sustain the funding to maintain fare free, is there an appetite among your board to, if this legislature were to say, we'll give you half if your communities, your subscribing communities cover the other half? Is the board and their represented communities at all considering upping their ante so as to maintain fare free?
You want to jump in, Amy? I don't want to put you on
May
the
not be
spot.
a representative person to ask. I think we're open to lots of kind of solutions and looking at it in a variety of different ways so that we're serving the communities and not burdening the municipality and the tax base. I happen to think that there's lots of partners throughout the systems for whom recognize transportation is a challenge and yet are not contributing to the solution the same way a municipality is and the universities are. So I think there's room, but I, for one, am always open to different ideas to do it.
Marlene, I'm sorry, I didn't come back to you.
No worries. So number one, I think it's amazing and awesome that GMT had fare free before Boston did. And the second one, maybe you covered this earlier, but I find this number really interesting and important is what was that budget number that you had to go looking for from the legislature?
So fare revenue across the entire state of Vermont was about $2.5 million. 500,000 of that was the rural properties across the state, and about just over 2 million of that was fare revenue that the Chittenden County system generated. And so we were not looking for that full amount. That was definitely because our ridership was down. We were looking the revenue we would have generated from fares would have been less than that 2 million. But ultimately, as service has come back, and as I mentioned on our local routes, it really has come back. It's roughly just over $2 million.
Over $2 million is what we're looking for. Thank you.
Yes. And we did we have some innovative things happening with funding. For example, we worked with CATMA and the institutions this current fiscal year to have an arrangement for a contribution into GMT instead of what we had pre-pandemic was a per swipe fee. We would bill for all the swipes that students and faculty took on GMT. And so that was a great partnership. Hopefully it works out, for everybody to have that arrangement continue. But that's the type of private-public partnership we would be sort of looking at in the future to generate some more of this non-federal local match.
Maybe one more question? Any?
What are the biggest inhibitors to increasing the frequency of service on our urban routes?
Money, that's the biggest at the moment.
It's flashy that we're getting capital money for like new buses.
Totally.
Don't hear a lot about operations.
Yeah, it's we have a couple challenges right now. Staffing is a huge challenge for us. We've just put a lot of service reductions in place in Washington County because we lost 4 bus drivers, which was 30% of our driving force down there, workforce. And so we continue to have recruitment issues. We are down mechanics, which means some days we have buses available, we have drivers available, but we, for some reason, some very small issue will keep a bus out of the system. And so that's definitely causing issues for us. And Steve Falvey will be presenting at 3:30 on a transit financing study, which looks at revenue for the state, ways that the state of Vermont can sort of, what can we do to fund transit that takes that funding out of the transportation bill. And so we have a dedicated transportation funding moving forward, which would generate an additional roughly $5 million to allow for expansion of service.
Just sort of following up
Yeah.
on that, will there be a discussion that would follow that presentation that would say, okay, now we've got, some plans, how do we make them happen?
And that would be really great, Jean. I don't know what Steve's intention is post presentation, but it would be great to see something similar to this where folks could hop on and, I'm happy to share this with him and folks are welcome to provide feedback here as well.
I think we've talked about this in relationship to the city of Burlington's role, and I would just really encourage that, so that it's just not another study that gets sit on, I think there are lots of communities all over the place that could get involved. So
the challenge with the transit financing study is that nobody sort of owns it at the moment, and you want to talk to that, Eleni? Sorry.
maybe Senator Chittenden.
So we actually Steve and Charlie went to the legislature last year and they did presentations after the study was done. They went to the House and the Senate Transportation Committees, and they presented. There was not next steps associated, but we do have Steve on retainer this year as an RPC to actually continue on the education of our legislature, and maybe if we have like a coalition of people that they want us thinking about, because we need funding. Bottom line is like we need funding to actually create the robust system we want to have in this county. So let's have that discussion after the presentation.
That would be great.
Sure.
And I'll just add one thing, I mean, the fare-free discussion that's been happening, VTrans was tasked to also study fare-free as a legislative study. And so that's being wrapped up, again, it was done by Steve Fauble. So that'll be a presentation this next legislative session that you'll see. And so about where to go with fare-free. And that funding study is definitely a part of the puzzle to work together. And so, but we'll wait for the legislature to let us know what to do.
Any other questions? Thank you. Thanks for coming.
Thank you.